4 years ago, I made a video called King Philip's War, the most important American war you've never heard of, which provided a brief overview of the tragic late 17th century conflict which saw an alliance of Native American nations fight to the death against the ever-encroaching Puritan colonists of New England. As of this filming, this is the premier King Philip's War video on the net, with over 800,000 views. It's the first thing that pops up when you search King Philip's War into YouTube, and it regularly appears as the top result of Google searches. But when I made this video, I was at the very beginning of my YouTube career. I only had like 300 subscribers, and since nobody was really watching my stuff, I was pretty lazy in my approach to online historical education. This was before I included footnotes and citations in my videos, and most horrifyingly, I wrote the script of this original King Philip's War video almost entirely from memory. I know a lot about King Philip's War, but any lesson taught from memory is going to have problems. And this video does indeed have problems. I still regard it as a pretty decent overview of the basic events of the war, but there are enough niggling little errors and mischaracterizations that an addendum is necessary. So now I've come back to one of the original filming locations for that video, my hometown cemetery, an old Puritan colonial cemetery in beautiful Wayland, Massachusetts, to provide some much-needed corrections and clarifications. Let's hop right in. I'm in the woods of Wayland, Massachusetts. This is the town where I grew up. Yes, I grew up here, God help me.
King Philip's War, the conflict that bears Metacomic's Christian name, was the bloodiest war per capita in American history. It shaped our national psyche, irrevocably changed the way colonists and Indians saw one another, and opened the door to Anglo-American domination of this continent.
In history class, this is what they tell you about the founding of our country. In 1620, the Pilgrims landed. And then in 1776, we declared our independence. They never seem to talk about what happened in between. And they should, because it is a fascinating story. I agree with my past self here 1000%. And if that's all viewers take from this old video, then it will have done its job.
In 1675, there were 4 English colonies in New England. Massachusetts Bay, the largest, stretched from the Atlantic coast to the upper Connecticut River Valley. Plymouth centered around the Pilgrims' Landing and incorporated Cape Cod. Connecticut was made up of port towns on Long Island Sound and farming communities up the Connecticut River to the modern-day border with Massachusetts. And then there's Rhode Island, the black sheep of the bunch. It was largely populated by Baptists, Quakers, and other religious exiles.
So this map is based on a map drawn in the 1950s by historian Douglas Edward Leach in his definitive history of King Philip's War, Flintlock and Tomahawk. And it's not the best. The biggest omissions are labels for the Pecumtuck and Pennacook nations, which are bizarrely nowhere to be found, whereas the Pequots are labeled prominently, despite them having been effectively destroyed a generation earlier. Also, I labeled the Narragansett village of Pawtuxet as Pawtucket. And for that, I should probably just rip up my birth certificate and have my credentials as a New Englander permanently revoked.
There were about 10,000 natives across the region in 1675. The major tribes were the Nipmuc, the Mohegan, the Narragansett, and the Wampanoag.
Ow, my ears! That pronunciation is pretty cringy. That's pretty embarrassing. It's Wampanoag. Wampanoag.
Each tribe was ruled by a sachem, a paramount chief. The sachem of the Pokanoket Wampanoag was Metacomet, King Philip himself. He was educated at Harvard.
No, he wasn't. I'm getting Metacomet's biographical information confused with James the Printer and John Sassamon, who we'll meet in just a second. And while the Wampanoag interacted quite a bit with English people on a day-to-day basis, Metacomet himself was not unusually intimate with them, as I seem to imply here. In January 1675, Josiah Winslow, governor of the Plymouth colony, took a meeting with John Sassamon, a praying Indian. Sassamon warned him that Metacomet was planning a major offensive against the English. His goal? To drive them back into the sea. So that's a very dramatic line for a documentary, but the fact is we have no idea what Metacomet's actual goals were. I think I'm ascribing a bit too much of a Rome Total War mindset on the Wampanoag here. Driving your enemy into the sea is a very Eurasian objective, militarily speaking. The Algonquin conception of warfare just didn't really operate like that. Now, in the spring of 1676, native raids did penetrate painfully deep into the colony's interior, and for a second there, the future of New England was genuinely in doubt. But that was the result of the conflict, right? Not the origin of it. And I don't think Metacomet was thinking in terms of grand strategy when he first started conspiring to make war on the English. The Wampanoag under Metacomet had suffered humiliating mistreatment at the hands of the government of Plymouth Colony, to the point where violence was Metacomet's only recourse according to the code of honor in his culture. Likewise, he found common cause among the sachems of the Nipmuc. Now, religious and economic pressures from Massachusetts Bay had destabilized Nipmuc society so badly that war seemed preferable to a slow death by assimilation, which had been the fate of the Massachusetts nation. And it was these two, the Wampanoag and the Nipmuc, that would form the alliance that would fuck New England's shit up. Now, I think their ferociousness had more to do with desperation than it did with any calculated strategy. It was a final mad gamble to retain their sovereignty. I don't think any native politician or warrior with their head on straight seriously thought that they could get rid of the English entirely.
Later that month, John Sassamon's body was found beneath the ice of Assawampset Pond. His neck had been broken.
The English arrested 3 Wampanoag men in connection to the murder. Another praying Indian testified against them, and in June 1675, they were hanged. Soon word of the executions reached Mount Hope, Metacomet's homeland. The Wampanoag were outraged. In their view, the English had exceeded their authority and set a dangerous precedent.
2 weeks later, a band of Wampanoag warriors burned the town of Swansea in Plymouth to the ground and slaughtered many of its inhabitants.
So I get that these are just the basic facts of what happened and that time is a factor, but I really should have included a word about how the English had built Swansea at the junction of the Mount Hope Peninsula with the mainland, just down the hill from Metacomet's seat of power at Pokanoket. The placement of the town had been a huge point of contention between Plymouth Colony and the Wampanoag Nation, and this attack did not just come out of nowhere. But watching this old video and not knowing anything about it, you could very easily get that impression.
Historians such as Douglas Edward Leach have suggested that war came before Metacomet was truly ready. Perhaps the attack on Swansea had been the work of a few hot-headed young warriors, acting contrary to Metacomet's orders.
And that's a valid interpretation of events, but I can't say I agree with that theory anymore.
The violence the Indians committed that summer was extreme. Men, women, children, and livestock were indiscriminately butchered.
Not indiscriminately. No. Selectively. No, but seriously, this is a pretty Eurocentric view. From the English perspective, the violence was indiscriminate, but Algonquin warfare was surgical in its focus. Each target was picked very specifically, usually to avenge some kind of wrong committed in the past. So I think it's pretty clear I didn't know as much about Algonquin warfare when I made this video as I do now. I also wish I'd gotten into more specific incidents of native raids on English villages, because there are some harrowing stories that come out of that. The colonies assembled an army of 1,000 men, the biggest New England had ever seen, and marched off to Rhode Island. On December 19th, 1675, after marching for days through the frigid wilderness of the Great Swamp, the army came across a heavily fortified Narragansett village. They took a moment to gawk at the fortifications. They were unlike anything the Algonquin had ever built. Well, I don't know about that. The Algonquin built lots of forts. There was the Mystic Fort at the Pequot War. But to be fair, the Narragansett fort in the Great Swamp was the largest Algonquin fort that the English had ever seen, by far. The execution of this video leaves a lot to be desired, but that sound design is actually pretty good. The whole like and the woman screaming, yeah, that's pretty evocative. Meanwhile, Metacomet and the Wampanoag wintered west of the Berkshires in the colony of New York. There he attempted to convince the Mohawk tribe to enter into the war on his side. Instead, the Mohawk turned on him and nearly destroyed his army. Metacomet returned to Massachusetts in February 1676, his army crippled and his reputation damaged beyond repair. Spring brought more attacks on English villages. The natives were more ferocious and daring than ever, and their raids went all the way to the Atlantic coast. This part is all fine. I could have gone into more detail here, but it's whatever.
The fire of native resistance was burning down to its embers. The fearsome Nipmuc, who had inflicted worse defeats against the English than any other tribe, were effectively neutralized at the Battle of Turner's Falls in May 1676.
So no, this is a pretty egregious mischaracterization. This bit is in reference to the Peskiumskut massacre, which is when a bunch of English soldiers showed up at a prominent fishing camp near the Connecticut River where a bunch of native non-combatants had gathered. Captain William Turner, the Turner of Turner's Falls, went in all guns blazing and murdered a lot of women and children before a larger native force showed up to come to the rescue. Turner's militia found itself quickly outmatched, and most of them got themselves killed in a fighting retreat back to the town of Deerfield. So was it a battle? Yes, but the headline here should be massacre. And did it neutralize Nipmuc power? Not particularly. It was a major setback and a tragedy for sure, but I think I'm overstating the case here. King Philip was dead, but several of his men survived the August 12th battle, including his shrewd chief lieutenant, the aged Anawan.
Captain Church, acting on information provided by Wampanoag prisoners, tracked Anawan to his camp, descending down a sheer cliff face to achieve the element of surprise.
But instead of fighting, Anawan decided to take a meal with Benjamin Church. He even presented him with Metacomet's own belt of wampum as a sign of respect. That whole honorable enemies story comes from Benjamin Church's own memoirs, which are a great on-the-ground account of combat in King Philip's War, but Benny Boy does tend to be a bit self-aggrandizing, and I like to take him with more than a pinch of salt. If I was making this video today, I would probably phrase it along the lines of Church claims XYZ happened instead of XYZ happened.
Most crucially, King Philip's War set a precedent for how Anglo-Americans would treat Native Americans, namely with slaughter, enslavement, and confinement on reservations. Throughout the war, hundreds of praying Indians who were suspected of colluding with the enemy were banished to a barren, windswept rock in Boston Harbor called Deer Island. Many of them starved or froze to death there. Those Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett who survived King Philip's War fled west, to upstate New York and beyond. In June 1675, the English and the natives had shared power in New England. 18 months later, the white man was the undisputed master of all the land from the sea to the Hudson River.
This is absolutely correct, and I think this is ultimately the big historical headline of King Philip's War, which is, though both sides committed acts of unspeakable violence, the fate of the Indians of southern New England and the fate of the big three nations, the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, and the Narragansett, was a ruthless extermination by the English that would define relationships between settlers and natives until the turn of the 20th century. I wish I'd expounded on that point more. Deer Island deserved certainly more than a passing mention. The ethnic cleansing in the summer of 1676 and the widespread enslavement of hostile natives or natives perceived to be hostile is a big part of the story that's often left out and shouldn't be. But that about does it. Again, I think this video is a pretty solid introduction to King Philip's War, and I frame it as a 101 thing, a simple basic introduction, and it does what it says on the tin. But it's also quite flawed. It's oversimplified, Eurocentric, and certainly not up to my current standards of quality. If you're here because you just came over from that video and you want to learn more, I have a whole playlist on my channel with all of my King Philip's War videos arranged in chronological order. And if you're already going through the playlist, keep watching. Shit's about to get good.